Good afternoon and welcome. Hopefully everybody can see me and hear me. I've got a smile from Nick, so hopefully that's a good sign. For those of you overseas, good morning and good evening, and thank you for joining us today. In today's webinar, we will be decoding global talent and taking a look at how COVID-19 is changing workforce mobility. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and attendees will receive the recording along with a link to download the Decoding Global Talent report in an email from GoToWebinar after the session. So what are we going to cover today? We'll be looking at how the COVID pandemic has truly reshaped the world of work and our preferences around migration and destination. We'll outline the most popular destination choices for workers, looking at the most popular cities and countries, which has changed significantly since the last report, and how remote work is reshaping the working dynamic and what these changes mean for your organizations, and the things that you need to consider as employers in order to attract and retain the best talent. After the presentation, we'll be joined by a panel of business leaders from the UK, USA, and Germany to answer your questions around how we navigate this new terrain. So who am I, you might be wondering? My name is Kavanagh. I joined Stepstone and the network team in April 2020. And prior to that, I worked for Totaljobs for 18 years. I was actually an international remote hire, and I was onboarded completely remotely this time last year. I'm also a mum to two wonderful young boys, and when I'm not working or homeschooling them at the moment, I'm normally found running around Normandy in Guildford on my yoga mat or baking cupcakes. I'm delighted today to be joined by Nick South from BCG, and I'll hand over to Nick now so that he can introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about BCG. Over to you, Nick.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick South. I'm a partner in the Boston Consulting Group's office in London. I've been with BCG for 18 years, and for the last 10 years I've led the people and organisation practice in the UK, and for the last couple of years also in Netherlands and Belgium. That means all the work I do is around operating model and organisation, people strategy, culture and change management. I've got 4 kids, 3 of whom are looking forward to getting back and seeing their friends when they get back to school in the UK on the 8th of March on Monday, after what feels like weeks of homeschooling. So that's a bit about me.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, just in terms of the organisation, it's a Boston Consulting Group. It's an international management consultancy, and we work with all sorts of different organisations, public sector, private sector, every kind of industry, all around the world on their most complex strategic issues.
Thanks, Nick. I was just about to say, my kids are very much looking forward to getting back to school on Monday, and I too am looking forward to my kids going back to school on Monday. I was battling with them this morning to do their maths homework, and I threatened to do this presentation for them. It worked a charm. I wish I'd realised that last year. So some of you might be wondering, who is the network and what do we do? So the network is a global advertising alliance of leading job sites around the world, co-founded by Totaljobs and Stepstone in 2002. The network enables recruiters to reach global candidates through one local solution, offering convenience, coverage, a single point of contact, and one invoice in one currency. We have 60 partners across 138 countries, and our mission is to provide a go-to and unique solution to enhance the business of international recruiters. Totaljobs, having been a part of the network since it was founded in 2002, have been helping UK companies recruit internationally for almost 20 years now. And this is the 3rd time that they have participated in the GTS. And we first started working with Boston Consulting Group as the network in 2014. And this is the 3rd report that we have published together. And we're thrilled and honoured to be working with the BCG team again. Feedback so far has been that this iteration of the Global Talent Survey is our strongest and most valuable collaboration to date. And I'm pleased to be able to share some of those findings with you today alongside Nick from BCG. So let's kick off with a look at the global labour market and the current level of cases and vaccinations across the world. So let's firstly consider the global labour market. and what unemployment rates currently look like. So we know that the global economy has experienced the biggest turmoil since the Second World War. The UK unemployment rate currently stands at 5.1%, with nearly 10 million people furloughed last year alone. There were 819,000 fewer workers on the payroll in November than at the start of the pandemic. Yesterday, we heard that the UK unemployment rate is set to peak at 6.5%. The 37 member countries of the OECD saw an unemployment rate of 6.9% in December 2020, remaining 1.7% above February 2020, before the Covid-19 pandemic hit the labour market. In December, the unemployment rate was stable in the euro area at 8.3%, and that was 1% above the February level. And in the US, the unemployment rate was stable at 6.7%, so 3% higher than in February 2020. In spite of stable aggregate unemployment rates in the OECD and the euro area, in December, the OECD youth unemployment rate, so that's people aged 15 to 24, increased slightly to 14.4%, up from 14.2% in November. In the euro area, the youth unemployment rate increased to 18.5% in December, from 18.1% in November, the second consecutive monthly increase. The OECD predicts that unemployment could remain relatively high at 8.9% by the end of 2021. And research from the International Monetary Fund has estimated that 97.3 million individuals, or roughly 15% of the workforce in the 35 countries analysed, are classified as being high risk of being furloughed or made redundant as a result of COVID-19. A very, very grim picture and an extremely challenging time for workers and, of course, employers who have both local and international hiring needs. And it's important to note from this information and these figures is that clearly some demographics have been more severely affected than others in this pandemic. So we are seeing some positive signs in the UK with the rollout of the vaccination programme and the details of our roadmap out of lockdown, which were announced last week. With this first step, our children being returned to school next Monday, and non-essential retail will be opening on the 12th of April, along with outdoor hospitality, which is fantastic. We also heard yesterday that our economy should be back at pre-pandemic levels by the middle of next year. But however, globally, 115 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 worldwide, with 2.5 million deaths. Vaccines offer us a beautiful light at the end of the tunnel, and the UK has actually now gone over the 20 million vaccination mark. I believe as of this morning, it was had just gone over, it was about to go over 21 million having their first dose vaccination. And that's approximately 39% of adults in the UK have now been vaccinated with their first dose. And I believe it's almost 1 million people now who've had their second dose. Overall, the US and China have given the most doses, but the UK is the third highest per capita in the world, just behind UAE and Israel. Some countries, including the UK, have actually secured more vaccine doses than their populations actually need, while other lower income countries are relying on a global plan known as COVAX, which is seeking to ensure that everyone in the world has a vaccine. So ultimately, the speed in which the global economy recovers is very much intertwined with the vaccination rollout country by country. And we can see this in the UK with our exit strategy out of lockdown very much interlinked into the speed at which we can vaccinate our population. So let me tell you a little bit kind of why we ran this survey and our thinking behind it. So last year, not only were we submerged into our global health crisis, we also experienced a social crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. All of these things have undoubtedly had a massive impact on each and every one of us. And this in turn has led to many changes and preferences in the world of work. We now stand at the gateway of a new world of work. And as employers, it's essential that we understand this and what it means to our businesses. There will be 3 reports from this study. The first covering global mobility, which launched today and we'll be talking you through. Soon to be followed by report number 2, looking at new working models and preferences. And report number 3, which will look at changes in people's career prospects in reskilling and expectations at work. So let me give you an idea of the scale of the project. The survey launched worldwide in October 2020 in over 25 languages, and it was live for 6 weeks. The survey consisted of 40 questions looking at a range of topics from mobility to diversity and sustainability. All questions aimed at really trying to understand and unearth what is truly important to workers across the world. Almost 209,000 respondents globally across the Americas, Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Our initial goal was actually to get 100,000 responses, so we far exceeded this, and the amazing response rates were absolutely down to the amazing work of all of our global partners, for which we're very grateful. This is a truly representative report. There's nothing else like this in the marketplace. We have insights from 190 countries, and you can see the global representation here on this map with the colours denoting the sample sizes by country. And what do these global respondents look like demographically? There's an almost equal split between male and female. The age group of respondents is predominantly between 20 to 40 years of age. The majority are junior staff, followed by lower management, and almost 3/4 have a bachelor's degree or equivalent, so highly educated sample. And respondents are from a range of industries. So let's start firstly by taking a look at the impact of last year on mobility, and we can see that there has been a definite shift. If we consider willingness to move abroad, this presents a very, very different picture to the one that we saw back in 2014 and in 2018. Only 50% of people worldwide are willing to move abroad for work as of 2020. This has dropped 14% since 2014. In the UK, 48% of people are willing to work abroad, a sharp fall from 62% in 2018, and this figure was actually 44% in 2014. So the reasons for the uptick in 2018 is possibly a response to the Brexit referendum result, which was in 2016. But the ramifications now of Covid-19 have clearly impacted the desire to emigrate. Willingness to move abroad and work abroad is higher for younger workers. So 64% of those surveyed said they were willing to work abroad, and younger workers is anybody kind of classed under the age of 30. And those who are highly educated being those who have a doctorate or more. 63% of those surveyed said they would move abroad for work. And willingness to move abroad is most prominent in the legal, tech, and the science industries, all suggesting there is real risk of brain drain, as these are the types of candidates who are in most demand across the world. And interestingly, in some countries, the willingness to move abroad has increased, such as in Brazil, Italy, and Sweden, possibly due to pandemic handling in those particular countries. So this slide gives us an overview of the top 10 most attractive countries that candidates would relocate to for work and how this differs from previous years. We have seen a reordering of the top 10 countries, which is very, very interesting. Canada is now the #1 destination of choice for foreign workers. The US has fallen for the first time in 8 years to second place. This is possibly due to pandemic management and Canada being viewed as having a more open culture and better social systems. Strong pandemic management from New Zealand, Japan, Singapore sees them climb the rankings, with New Zealand and Singapore making the top 10 for the first time. Many EU nations have lost appeal. Germany has fallen 2 places. In spite of their strong pandemic management, they have still been tarnished by a high number of cases in Europe and a pullback from previously strong support for immigration. Italy, Spain, and France have fallen, and only France remains in the top 10 today. And a really notable shift is South Korea. So South Korea were 37th in 2014. They were 24th in 2018. And now in this most recent research, they're 12th. So this is a country whose language is not widely spoken, but has gained 12 places, which really shows the importance that workers now place on public health. The UK has retained 5th position from 2018, and the UK is most popular to workers in the Republic of Ireland, South Africa, Poland, Nigeria, and Denmark. So this map, so this one, let me explain. It plots the top 20 countries that people would relocate to in 2020. So along the bottom, you've got the COVID cases per 1 million inhabitants. And on the left-hand side, we've plotted the changes in position for each country and where they've kind of moved up and down in this survey. There's a direct correlation between pandemic management and your attractiveness as a destination of choice in the new world, as those countries on the top left of the graph have had fewer cases and have increased in popularity. So generally, countries who have reported a lower number of COVID-19 cases as a result of strict restrictions, such as border closures early on in the pandemic, have made the most gains when it comes to their appeal to global workers. In comparison, countries with the highest rates of COVID per 1 million inhabitants have performed worse in the latest results. Interestingly, the US and the UK have not fallen as much as other countries, suggesting that the allure of both the UK and the US as destinations of choice has been able to withstand the greater impact of the crisis. So now I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to look at changes around the cities that we most want to work in and attractiveness of remote work.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Kate. And maybe if we just go on to the next slide, as well as looking at the country level, we also look at the attractiveness of different cities around the world for people looking to move abroad for work or considering it. And the good news for the UK here is London's position. So as Kate said, UK as a whole went from second to fifth between 2014 and 2018 as it stayed there. But in every survey we've run, 2014, 2018, 2020, London has retained that top spot as the most attractive city for people considering working abroad anywhere in the world. That's obviously great news. Now that isn't, of course, automatic. So you might think, well, is it just one of those things that once you're there, you stay there? But if you look at New York, for example, New York was second when we first started running these surveys, but this year has slipped 6 places down to 8. Among the European cities, one place that will be very pleased with this the survey results will be Amsterdam. And it's been very interesting actually over the last couple of months listening to stories about where work is moving post-Brexit, and Amsterdam keeps popping up as a place where people are looking to set up places and so on. And there's something in the Amsterdam story at the moment which is very compelling for people. I think the other thing that's interesting about this data is what's going on in the Middle East and Asia. So Dubai has moved up to 3rd place. Abu Dhabi has gone up 9 places to 5th. Tokyo and Singapore have moved up to 6th and 7th. So if we can, and I think, you know, similar to what Kate was saying about South Korea and where it was in 2014 and where it is now, the kind of changing perceptions of Middle Eastern and Asian cities and countries as desirable places to work has really shifted over those last 6 years. If we go to the next slide, it's quite interesting. I think this reflects the nature of the London economy, if you like, but also the sort of work and career opportunities that people perceive there to be in London. And that's the point, that it's less appealing for blue collar workers and it's much more appealing for white collar workers. And when we look into the data, we see particularly strong appeal for people working in finance, in digital and technology, in media, in law. And then if we go to the next slide, we see that it's you know, actually equally attractive for people whether they've got a university education or a high school education. I think the other interesting thing in terms of London is the countries where people are most positive about London, and there's a mix there. So there are countries where you've got strong historic and language ties, like South Africa and Nigeria. There are countries which are European countries that have got very strong historic working connections. So Portugal and Spain, Poland, Romania, those countries have had very historic ties. You know, London's seen very, very attractively there as well. But also, London's #1 for economic powerhouses like China. So a real diversity of where people are seeing sort of London's enduring appeal. And I think it's worth spending a bit of time before I move on, just exploring that piece around why London has this enduring appeal, and cities like London. And I think there's 3 things to really highlight. One is the diversity of the city. So London's one of those cities and actually New York's very similar profile actually, where of a population of around 8 million people, 3 million people in the city weren't born in that country. And so you've got very strong communities of different nationalities. And so people considering where they might want to move to, where they might have connections, family or community connections, where they can make a home and feel at home. Those sort of cities that have got those strong, diverse, cosmopolitan populations, that's a real advantage. I think the second feature is just the nature of the economy in a city like London, which is very much linked to services, to occupations like financial services, law, media, to digital, creative industries, etc. And when you look then at the pools of people who are most willing to move abroad for work around the world, they are those people working in finance, in tech, in science, in research. And so they are attracted to places where they can see the opportunity to build rewarding careers and help them advance. And then the third factor I'd highlight is just that buzz and dynamism that you get in truly global cities like London and other places. And I think that's what's been really interesting. I've been doing a lot of work in recent months over the future of work and what's going to happen to work post-COVID. And there's obviously lots of things going on there. And one of the things that I think most people are pretty clear about is that we're going to see post-COVID a shift to more hybrid models of work. I think that's pretty clear. And I think forward-looking organisations are thinking quite creatively now about how they design models of work for their populations that enable them to tap into different pools of talent. And that could be, on the one hand, people living in communities around big cities who can't or don't want to work 5 days a week in a city, but are prepared to work 2 or 3 days a week commuting, and so you can tap into those pools. But you can also tap into pools of people who could potentially work in a different way, much more remotely for an organisation. However, and I think this is where this ties back to this question, what's really interesting is when you look at 200,000 people globally and their aspirations for work and where they're attracted to, there's still this sort of buzz and energy of cities like London that is hugely appealing. So I think for all organisations thinking about those future working models and the sort of employee value proposition they want to offer, they shouldn't lose sight of that appeal and therefore where that might fit in the mix of what they want to offer. So just some reflections there on how this ties with these questions about the future of work. We just go to the next slide then. I think this is a really interesting thing. So Kate's already highlighted the fact that the proportion of people willing to move abroad for work last year has dropped from sort of 2/3 of people 6 years ago to more like half now. However, interestingly, the thing we've asked this year is, would you be willing to work remotely for an international employer? And here you see a bigger proportion, 57% of people saying, yes, I would be willing to do that. And I think, you know, as we again think about future models of work, there are real questions about how prevalent fully remote models are likely to be compared to more hybrid models where people are working either 2 or 3 days a week in the office or going to an office once or twice a month, you know, different models of that. But I think there is a sense, and I think that will be much more common than people going to fully remote models. However, there's no question that particularly for certain specific talent pools and niche skills, there is a lot more openness to some of this very remote working, and all sorts of platforms are a bit sort of opening up to help people tap into those sorts of talent pools. And I think the interesting thing here is there's a whole bunch of people out there who are much more open to working that way than perhaps people would have imagined in the past. We just go to the next slide. I think that gives a bit of data on this. I think it's an interesting story for US-based companies here, actually, where on the left-hand side, we saw this year that around 20% of people are saying, look, I'd be open to moving to the US to work. 25% of people saying, I'd be willing to work for a US-based company remotely. So there's clearly, as people think about their image of US-based companies and the sorts of names that you can imagine, the idea of working for them is very positive, and they're actually more open to that idea of doing that remotely than they are to the sort of prospect of, well, how practically would I be able to move to the US? So kind of interesting thing there. And if we just then go to the next slide, I think this is kind of an interesting bit of data as well, saying, look, this sense of willingness to work remotely for someone else. Really, there are some real geographic differences here. So you look in Latin America, countries like Mexico and Brazil. You look at places in Africa, for example, and people are very open to this idea of working remotely. And so there's pools of talent in these places for whom they're thinking this is a real opportunity for me. On the other hand, if you look in the Middle East, countries like Kuwait and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, that's where you saw the least willingness to work in this way. From a UK point of view, interestingly, 57% of our UK workers are willing to do this, in line with that global average, which is more open to that than workers, for example, in the US or in Germany. So again, as we think about, for those of you who are based in the UK, your sort of UK-based populations, Kate was talking earlier about the prospect and risks of brain drain. This is a potential, worry if you're not able to have a compelling proposition for people. Okay, last slide I just want to cover before we finish, and that's just to kind of try and tie all of this back, this whole thing about global talent mobility, to this broader question about the future of work. And as I say, we've been doing a lot of research in this space. We've been seeing how people want to work, how people have experienced the pandemic, how they want to work in the future. And I think there's some real challenges for organizations. One is you need to think about this very holistically rather than narrowly. So it's not just about how do we use our space. It's not just about what can we do with our physical footprint. It's not just about what hybrid models should we offer. It's very much about how we work, how we lead, how we organize, and what we need. And so I think there's 4 things to highlight here. I think in terms of how we work, what I see the most forward-looking companies doing is really thinking hard about what their customers want. So how have our customers experienced the pandemic? What do they want in the future? And how do we need to organize around that? Secondly, how do we lead? I think one of the great lessons of the whole pandemic was how much people valued empathetic, positive leadership, where leaders connected, understood, were sensitive to people's backgrounds, and people are looking for that sort of leadership they've seen enduring in new models of work going forward. Thirdly, how we organise, clearly people thinking about, well, what sort of models of work do we want to offer? What hybrid models are right for different teams and job families? How do we adapt those for individual needs and preferences? And then how do we tap into, as I was just hinting at, new talent markets for people who are truly location agnostic and who we can work with us on maybe on a project basis for specific objectives, for specific skills we need in new ways. And then lastly, how do we change our physical footprint? What do we do? How do we design the workplace of the future? What tech do we need? What spaces do we need? What mix of individual offices versus social space do we need? And lastly, what exactly do we need in terms of footprint? Where do we need offices? What do we need office for? How much space do we need? So I think there's a whole bunch of questions there to consider, and we can certainly get into that in the panel discussion. But I do think as we think about these things around global talent mobility, we now need to think about those things very much in this broader context. But I'll stop there, Kate, and we can move over to the panel.
Thanks, Nick. So a lot of really interesting takeaways for the audience today. And as you say, I'm sure we'll have lots to chat about in our panel. So just to kind of wrap up of our key findings today. So understandably, the crises of the last year have had a major impact on our way of life, and the allure of relocating for work has certainly lost its appeal, with certain countries impacted more than others. London has maintained its appeal as a top city destination, and it's clearly impervious to the perception of the UK as a whole. Canada, through its strong pandemic management, has taken the #1 spot from the US, even though surprisingly no Canadian cities actually appeared in the top 10 city lists. And remote work is now a part of our DNA, and this will remain to be the case, with many companies such as Coinbase, GitLab, Smart Recruiters, Siemens, Slack, Dropbox, Facebook adopting fully remote or hybrid working models in order to attract and retain the best talent and become more diverse organizations. It's worth considering, when you're recruiting, are you office first, hybrid, or remote first? And it's really important to think about this when you're trying to attract talent. There's a real opportunity here for UK employers to reach overseas talent to help plug those skill gaps that many will be facing. I read earlier this week more than half of UK employers are actually planning on recruiting in the next 3 months, according to a recent CIPD report. And with the strongest needs being in healthcare, finance, insurance, education, and IT, a lot of employers will have to look outside UK borders in a need to fill those roles with regards to international hires. So now we can turn to our panel of industry leaders and look at what this actually means to your businesses in more detail. Okay. Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. So I will let you introduce yourselves while I have a look and see what questions are coming through. So John, shall we start with you?
Sure. My name is John Wilson. I'm the CEO of Totaljobs Group here in the UK. And essentially we help companies solve recruitment problems. Chris?
My name is Chris Foreman. I'm the founder and CEO of Appcast, which is a proud network member in the United States and Canada. I also have 4 kids, but additionally 8 cows and now 8 sheep because we had babies last night. So
congrats.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Kirsten.
Hi, and I'm Kerstin Rotemil. I'm the CPO, Chief People Officer at Stepstone. Yeah, based in Germany. I'm German, so I hope I can bring a bit of a non-Anglo-American perspective into this discussion.
Thank you all for being here. So before we jump into the questions, obviously the report launched today, which is very exciting. We've already had lots of coverage. Like, kind of, what's any big surprises? Anything that you thought, wow, that's unbelievable? Like, Chris, you?
No, not really. The fact that the United States took a step back in terms of from a perception standpoint, being the #1 place where people would want to go to is not surprising. I think that COVID has clearly had a role in it. I think that there's also the political discourse that has hit, the dissonance that's hit the United States, but also, quite candidly, hit many countries around the world. We're dealing with a lot of political upheaval globally, had an impact. But one thing that I did want to underline is over the last couple of years, it's just become harder to come to the United States and work. Like literally, public policy under the Trump administration changed, and that, if you normalize out COVID, you normalize out the political, kind of hubbub, it's just been harder. And I think that may actually have played a role at a particular level. While Canada, our neighbors to the north, which have 1/10 the number of population and a fraction of the number of job opportunities, it's become easier to come to Canada. So I wonder, it'd be interesting to see if there are crosstabs about people's perceptions about where you can go, and the pain involved in getting there, and what role that played, not just. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think you make some great points, Chris. I think for me, I don't know if it was surprising, but it was incredibly interesting to see the impact that countries' management of COVID had on people outside of those countries' willingness to go there. And you see places like New Zealand perform so well. And then for myself, obviously, we're a company based in London, and when you work there, the difficulty the city has had over Brexit and the concerns with that, clearly how we handled COVID is always something that kind of ranks highly in the news feed, and you kind of wonder how that is portrayed outside. But with all of that, for London to still be the most popular city in the world for people to come to is excellent, really. It's great for the UK, it's great for London specifically. There's a lot we can be proud of, a lot to learn from, and there's a lot more still to do, but yeah, really pleased that it's still #1.
Great. Kirsten?
And yeah, I would add to that. I would say the results we have just seen, they are kind of showing clearly two trends that have been accelerated and amplified by COVID. Because the trend for I would say, a decreasing willingness to move abroad, we see that since, well, at least in Germany, we see it since 2014. And also this, the increased demand for remote working, that is also not something new, but it's been accelerated by COVID. So I think that's super interesting. I have to say, from a German perspective, it's also interesting. So obviously we are playing it very safe. So COVID has obviously managed us more into our, well, I would say, more stable approach of how we approach things. And I try to think about what could be an explanation for that. And I guess especially in regards to healthcare, well-being and safety, there might be something in the German system, because you guys might know the German health insurance and healthcare system. That's a pretty good one, right? And what we saw in the media in regards to hospitals, intensive care, the situation there, we did not see a lot of that in Germany. So there were enough hospital beds for people who were actually positive. So I guess this also might play into that mix, that people right now, they focus more on health and maybe staying in Germany, staying put for the time being. Maybe that makes a lot of sense for us right now.
Yeah, great.
How about you, Nick? Anything surprising for you?
No, I'll just echo what everyone else has said. I think the other thing that's interesting is just seeing the increasing appeal of Asian and Middle Eastern cities. I think that's been quite a shift over the last 6 years.
I think for me, the being South Korea jumping up so much, I just thought that was fascinating. And I think, like John pointed out, when we first looked at that map and we plotted the COVID cases against kind of popularities of the different countries, seeing kind of the correlation between, you know, those who had managed it better actually increasing in popularity. I thought that was really interesting. We do have our first question. So, well, this could go to all of you, but I'll direct it to you, John, and then we can pass it around. How do you think companies will begin to solve the complex pay reward challenges linked to any increase in virtual international working?
So let me just see if I understand the question. Is with international working mean we can hire technically from anywhere? How do we deal with the pay challenges? Is that right?
I think that's probably what they mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think that often when companies will go to seek talent from other countries, it's because of a shortage of talent within their own country. So I think actually one, companies need to understand where does it make sense to be looking locally. So when I think about how London performs as a multicultural city, is multicultural companies also help attract talent in, and that city helps attract talent in. So you want to make sure that you're making sure that you've got a business that's reflective of where you are, and it's fishing for that talent that's not available sometimes means that those salaries themselves will normalize. And then I think it's about, actually, are companies ready to manage that properly? So how do you support employees from a country where you don't have a specialism? How do we do that from an HR standpoint? How do we do that from payroll, etc.? And so I think there's capability and muscle that's required to be built in order to handle those problems, but also making sure that, like, I think we all understand that this is not going to be like this free-for-all where we hire people from all over the world straight away. It'll be very, very specific skill sets and very specific job types that we have difficulty hiring for in our own countries. But even then, that's not a simple process if you don't already have infrastructure in those countries. So I think that's where companies really need to understand more, is how do you support people when they're not in the country where you have your operations.
It's I can actually speak from experience with this one, because we actually hired somebody internationally remotely, and it's complicated. Like, it was a conscious decision that we made, because we're, you know, within the network team, we're a multicultural team from all over the world, and the person we hired was based in another country. It was complicated to do it, and it required a lot of HR muscle, as you say, and expertise. But there are people you can reach out to for that expertise, and I think that's the key, is that if this is a path that you're going down as a business, it's really important that you understand the policies and that you have the correct infrastructure in place in order to manage it, because it's absolutely worth it. It was a great experience for us. It was brilliant to be able to bring somebody in from another country, but like you say, it requires some extra expertise.
It's actually an interesting issue that is playing out not just internationally, but in the United States right now. So as a result of the pandemic, you've seen a ton of people temporarily, at least temporarily, maybe it's permanently, relocated to, out of Silicon Valley and out of New York, the two of the highest pay areas in the United States, which has led to really hard conversations about what pay will be if they move to a place like where Appcast is headquartered, which is 2 hours north of Boston, right near Dartmouth College, in a small town in rural America. And what's interesting is that the arguments are clear. Do you pay someone for the job they perform, or do you pay them based on the lifestyle that they should be able to afford for doing that job in the local market? And it's an interesting Warshot test. The majority of the folks that are handling this in the United States now are basically saying, no, we're going to pay you based on local market, and that's a very practical decision. They're what they are saying is that the ability to ensure static benefits, whatever they cost wherever you happen to be, so everyone has the same baseline, but your compensation should be proportionally the same compared to market wherever you happen to be. So if your standard is to pay 75% of market in Silicon Valley, then you should pay 75% of market in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Now, of course, it's exacerbated in a global situation where there's even greater pay disparity, but I think that's a fantastic question. It's probably going to be one of the bigger challenges that we see with remote work for practical. Forget about all the policy stuff. It's just, you pay somebody for what they're doing, or do you pay them, for what they're doing and where they work? Speaking of which, one of the things I did find that was super interesting is the fact that among people that the United States may have gone down a peg, but when you take a look at folks that are willing to work remote for a company, the United States is still number one. So, I'll wave Stripes flag here, and I say, I think that at least what I want to see in that data, whether or not that is actually true, because we all see what we want to see, is that people recognize that there's a lot of innovation, a lot of great companies, a lot of kind of a fundamental meritocracy, at least in US-based global companies, and that's still something that attracts a lot of people. The US right now may not be the place that they can get into or want to go to, but they still are interested in US companies.
Absolutely. So on the topic of remote work, I've got a question for Kirsten. How do employers onboard and engage a remote workforce?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's one of the big challenges we're seeing. We saw that during COVID, because from one day to the other, every one of us actually moved back home, working remotely, working from home, and there were new joiners. And I think that was a huge challenge for all employers. How do you actually do that? How do you bring people into the organization? How do you tell them about the culture? How do you get this, I would say, the social glue? How does that work? And I have to say, the majority of organizations, they did a fantastic job from one day to the other, because for most of them, the systems weren't there, right? No plan, no process, no systems. But I do believe this is going to be one of the big challenges that we're going to face in the future. With a rising number of remote workers, we need to make sure that they're not only onboarded properly, but they kind of belong to the organization. We can create this feeling of belonging, of sharing a purpose. And I think this is so much more difficult when you actually never see your coworkers. You're tucked away in some very remote location, and the only interaction you have is via a screen. So honestly, I don't know the answer yet, right? It's going to be a lot around how do we very clearly communicate purpose? How can we make culture tangible? How can you communicate? It's about collaboration, all of that. And this will keep us busy for the next couple of years to properly figure that out. But it's going to be, I would say it's going to be make or break. Because if we don't manage to bring people along with us, then it's going to be very hard to retain them. Yeah. Right? If they don't have this attachment to us as an employer, if they don't feel like they're part of something bigger, then there is no reason why they should stay with us if there is another remote work opportunity that maybe pays a little more. Then there will be no, I would say, emotional attachment to an organization. So this is something we have to solve for sure.
I think I saw a few data points on this come out of a recent survey in my company. And I think this is really where actively driving, supporting, and encouraging the culture that you have within your organization, you know, next to the work that the business does, is how do you connect people? Because as a leadership group, you may be able to onboard an individual and give them what they need to be successful, but that person is not walking down the corridor and bumping into people. They're not chatting to people as they exit a meeting. You know, they're not going to lunch in the canteen and meeting new colleagues. None of that stuff is happening. And I think being pretty focused on how do I create time in my people's day, right, where they have an opportunity to bump into people that they haven't met before. So the feedback that I got was, onboarding was fantastic and I love my new team, but I don't know anybody else in the organization. And yes, we can introduce ourselves, we can be part of work meetings and you see new faces, etc., and you introduce yourself, but you're straight into the work. And I think making time to connect with people, which is not about work, I think is critical. And that is probably just one facet that backs, well, how do I build a culture that still exists even when we're sitting in our kitchens doing webinars?
Yeah, just the point to add to that, I think it really emphasizes the nature of how leadership, the sort of the empathetic, connecting, people-centered dimensions of leadership, I think become hugely more important. I mean, they're always important. There are still many organizations that still had a bit of a command and control, hierarchical, tell people what to do feel. Whereas this sort of leadership that's been so important in COVID, I think will just be increasingly important as we move forward. And I think just the second thing to say is I do think then as people think about those different hybrid models, the different models of work, the models where as a minimum, you're sort of connecting people with people face to face once or twice a month, but often much more than that, will still be very important and attractive to people, because that kind of dimension of connectivity that you only get face to face and the apprenticeship that comes with that, I think a lot of people will really crave that, and that will matter as people design these future models.
Yeah.
Another question for you, John. What does this data suggest about the impact of Brexit on London and the UK?
Well, like I mentioned before, I think it's awesome that London is #1. And I'm really pleased that certainly from this perspective, it hasn't had an impact on how people consider London. I think one of London's crown jewels is obviously its financial insurance industry. And that's probably an area where we need to understand is actually how will this really play out. Nick, you talked about the rise of Amsterdam. And actually, if you look at revenue traded, I think is in January or February, Amsterdam actually overtook London in the volumes of revenue traded in the financial markets, which is crazy because London was double what it was in January at the same period last year. So Brexit is having some impact in some areas, but the fact that people still want to come to the city shows that maybe the concerns are probably not as great as they might have been otherwise. I would say, though, it is very much a London-centric attractiveness, if you think about that. So if you look back at 2014, is the UK, I think, was #2 in terms of a country's appeal, dropped to #5 That was in and around the time when the Brexit conversation was happening. So it has had some impact in the past for the country as a whole, but that doesn't seem to have affected London specifically. And that goes back to the things that you were saying, Nick. This multicultural, vibrant, world-leading city is very appealing for people. Also, the employers that we have in London are very appealing for people outside of the UK, and obviously the range of jobs that are available. So all of those things stack up. But I don't think we can say Brexit's been a zero-sum game. Not yet, anyway. I think there's probably more time to come through for that.
Sure. And I've got a question here, which I'll direct to Chris, is how can employers use this data to support their talent attraction strategies?
I am so glad you asked, Kate. That's a great question.
It's a great question.
I'm a pretty basic guy, and so when I read this report every time it comes out, one of the things I do is I think about, okay, I'm a head of talent acquisition at a big company. How can I use this? Because that's what I've done for 20 years, is try and solve their problems. And there's a couple things. First off, at Appcast, we do research as well every year that looks at the hundreds of millions of job ads that get posted through our platform, and look at how those job ads deliver applications and hires, because we can track the whole thing. And in a partnership with Harvard Business School, some research, we found that the number of non-cash benefits that are discussed in a job ad dramatically increases the apply rate that you get on that job ad. So if you say, hey, we have free peanuts at work, and you can bring a dog, and we take Thursday afternoons and go fly kites, and something else, it doesn't really matter. But if you talk about 4 of them, you get a 25% higher apply rate than if you only talk about 1 of them. And so to kind of riff on that research, I think that talking about this report in your job ads probably will be effective. If I'm a Canadian, like if I'm running talent acquisition in London and I want to recruit broadly from Europe or elsewhere in the world for a particular position, I would talk about this report. I'd say, hey, guess what? London is the #1 place based on the BCG network kind of talent global survey, and link out to it. Same thing for Canada. The United States. If in fact I was running talent acquisition and was open to remote work for my jobs, I would cast a very wide net. I would probably use crosstabs from this report to identify the countries where people are most interested in working for the United States remotely, and be sure to advertise there. All these little things, this is a treasure trove of information that you can utilize on your candidate sourcing side to engage job seekers, sell your value proposition as a company or an organization recruiting from these different countries, and increase the the yield that you get. And clearly, I mean, if I was the government of South Korea, I'd be buying billboards on this thing and talking about how great to come work in South Korea. So anyway, I think there's a ton of practical stuff that can come out of this report.
I think so. I think that's a really good point, actually. And I think one of the things we've seen is that country PR is quite important now. It's quite apparent in the report in terms of people have seen what's happened in each country. I've heard about candidates asking in interviews, what have you done during the pandemic for your employees? So I think on that note, I think the employee value proposition has to work a lot harder now. So I suppose the question for me is that what advice would you, and whoever wants to take this question is welcome to, what advice would you give to employers who are thinking about this now, thinking about, how do I communicate better with the talent pool that's out there? How do I attract people? How do I sell my company better? Go, Chris.
So research shows that that job seekers white collar job seekers evaluate companies very deeply when they apply. The first thing is to this is going to sound really basic. Be a good place to work. Okay. They're gonna find out. So like your Glassdoor rating, your reading, at Kununu or wherever it happens to be. If you're a great place to work, people are gonna learn about that. That's at the end of the day, the thing that everybody should worry about is just doing a good job. Outside of that, there's there's a variety of things that you can do. But probably most impactful is in the United States, there's been a couple of companies that have created technology that allow organizations to have their frontline employees create authentic, kind of feedback, whether it be video or through other commentary, to explain what it is really like to work at that company. And so let's say you're an organization that maybe doesn't necessarily have the best reputation. In fact, by definition, most companies have an average reputation. And if you want to ensure that a positive message gets out about the things that, let's say, you've done during COVID, which is a very now thing, and you're not going to see that showing up in the perception of your employment brand probably for 12 to 18 months. How can you accelerate that? Well, the way that you accelerate it is nobody's going to believe you as the company. You need to have your employees that have seen the benefit of this start to tell that story more aggressively.
Sure.
And so finding ways to ensure that gets done through video, through kind of commentary, and building that into your recruiting and talent acquisition process is going to be super important.
I think your first point though, Chris, is critical, is be a good place to work. And sometimes people can go, oh, that's really complicated, and it's actually not. Speak to people who work for you. They'll tell you what it's like to work there, and then go fix it. I think definitely at Totaljobs, we have very much an inside-out approach, which hits on a lot of the points that you mentioned, Chris, where we don't really go out to the world and shout about how great we are. We work with our team and try and make it great. And then that comes out anyway in terms of friends and family members and what have you that actually end up wanting to come and work for us. But I think that's the beginning of the seed. I don't think it's particularly difficult to fix the problems that you have as a company, and I'm sure we all have different ones.
And I would add to that. I would say be specific when you speak about your EBP or employer branding messages. There is no one size fits all. And I do see that very often, that one claim of one organization is very similar to other. And if you just see the claim, it would be very hard for you to tell which organization stands behind that claim. So I do believe, find out who you are, become better in what is important for you, and be very specific in communicating that message. Because I do believe people need to buy into who you are and into your cause. And that doesn't mean that you need all employees. You need to find the right fit. You need to find a cultural fit, a cultural add to your organization. And that might be perfect for you, but maybe not for another. So my recommendation really is be precise, be specific, and know exactly who you are and how your employees perceive you.
Yeah. Chris, sorry, Kate, I know you probably got another question, but I was really interested with your stat earlier that you did with Harvard Business Review, in that list 4 non-financial benefits that you get while you're at this company, and that will increase conversion rate. So what is conversion rate? Is people are voting, right, for your business because of what they see. And I think more and more companies are great at offering market value for their roles. So essentially that means we're all the same. Well, what's different then? And those are the things I think that are different. So you can get that across just in a job ad.
That's right.
She'll be doing more of that.
There you are. We fly kites on Thursdays.
Yes.
I'd love to ask some more questions, but we're actually at time.
Right.
So it just remains to be seen that we wrap up. So final from me, keep an eye on your inbox to get a link to download the full report, which will come from GoToWebinar. Please do get in touch with your local team if you have any hiring needs internationally, or click in the link in the follow-up email. As a final word from me today, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists and audience members for being here today. I'd also like to thank Nick for being here today, and all of the team at BCG. and all of our network partners for the amazing work they put into getting all of these respondents across the world. And finally, thank you Totaljobs for hosting the webinar today. It's really great. The conversation's been fantastic, and I hope to see you all again soon when we launch the second report.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.